to invest in early stage, which is often the most catalytic, the most important. The minister from South Africa mentioned that as well. So we got a $20 million grant facility to do just that. And believe it or not, that $20 million ended up mobilizing about $1 billion in a blended way, because it was sort of the right instrument. 20 million in equity grant facility. Literally, we developed the first utility scale solar in Rwanda, projects in West Africa. It was nimble, it was fast, but that dried up. When that facility dried up, basically, they couldn't do that anymore. And I think what we need to do more is institutionalize that. How do you not just institutionalize it, but how do you embed that in the private sector so that when a new administration or government changes, those things don't end? I think I might just say, I think it's clear that early stage, risk tolerant, nimble, committed capital to develop and build projects at scale is what we really need at this moment. The private sector sort of typically, as a mandate, thinks about sort of maximizing your returns, minimizing your risks, right? And when you think about it more in the context of, Africa, unfortunately, a few of the speakers today have already talked about that. It's quite exaggerated. There are real risks. And when you're thinking about new technologies in climate, in emerging markets, in Africa, it usually limits the private sector's role to participate. So to literally answer your question in a nutshell, I think what's really missing is enough risk-tolerant capital going to back projects at the very early stage. What you're seeing, I think, in Kenya, Nigeria, in the fintech sector, right, where you have a lot of investors coming in at the early stage, we need that for climate, but at a much, much more accelerated levels. Where, if I could be simple, if a total project cost is $100, is that really initial $5 coming in at the right time that really unlocks that 95? And that's what we need more of.
Mimi, thank you for being so specific. And if you will allow me, Minister Jørgensen, it sounds like there are countries who don't have the same level of ambition. And how does that make you feel when you hear that there are good programs and then they get sort of undone? Is there a way to institutionalize that leadership, like Mimi said?
Well, there's a lot of things we can do internationally to also improve the structures. For instance, the multinational development banks, especially the World Bank, they are in the middle of a reform process now and a new president, and I think there's definitely some potential there. Also, some countries, my own included, but also Sweden and others, have developed national measures where we use our own investment funds, so public investment funds for development policies. We use them as an instrument to de-risk and thereby mobilize private financing. So this also then means that governments need to be able to take the risks and also be able to argue to their publics, the taxpayers that at the end of the day pay for this, that sometimes we lose money, because that's the whole idea. Sometimes we will spend public money that, because it's a risky project, they will be lost. But bottom line will be that at the end of the day, we will have mobilized many, many times more than we could have done if we had not chosen these models.
Thank you. And Mimi, you've also given us unless you wanted to have another bite at that. I'll come back to you, I promise. But Mimi's given us another segue to Dennis, actually, because you were talking about the right capital at the right stage, and you talked about early stage investments and project prep. Dennis, we were speaking about this before the panel, but would love to hear your thoughts, especially around this reform agenda. What can institutions like import-export banks be doing, and why is that early stage capital so important?
No, thank you very much for having me. As a development financial institution, Afreximbank looked at ourselves and say, are we really fit for purpose in terms of attracting the capital that will be required for this transitional financing? Most of you remember that African Export-Import Bank is owned by African government. And in 2009, we began being rated by international rating agencies. And it's been a journey. So far, we have migrated from BBB- to BBB+ and even A. So we are then able to attract the necessary capital. But we have also made ourselves fit for purpose in terms of providing development partners with a credible story. Our own interventions on the continent in terms of both mitigation and adaptation has been very obvious. But in addition to that, what we've looked at is there is a problem both on the demand and supply side. So what do we do to ensure that on the demand side, there are credible, bankable projects? 4 years ago, we established a project preparatory facility. And to date, we've managed to bring $6 billion worth of projects out of that unit. But we recognize that there is more that is required. So we have also established a joint project preparatory fund. We have now attracted 8 other institutions to come to the party so that we can provide this early stage capital that is required. But in addition to that, we established a fund for export development to provide equity capital in order to tackle this as well. So that will complement our debt financing that we provide, but we also provide guarantees and insurance products to de-risk projects so that the private sector can come in and complement the public sector in providing additional funding.
And you mentioned fit for purpose and instruments which can help the private sector. I know we've got private equity coming up on the next panel, but Mimi, does that resonate? Are these products really what the private sector needs? I know you've been on both sides and interested in your reflections.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about what I'm doing currently. I think at 3 Cairns Group and at Allied Climate Partners, we are, working to expand and scale bankable projects for climate, and we're doing it in a blended finance way, specifically by providing first loss junior equity to create specific investment mandate for private investment across Africa. And the idea is really to de-risk for private investors and late-stage capital investors, including DFIs. I mean, the DFIs, development finance institutions, commercial investors, come in after things are de-risked. And as everybody knows, when things go to financial close, everybody's interested in financing the projects. And so alongside our partners at Sea Change Foundation and other major philanthropic capital, we're actually raising $235 million in philanthropy to go towards that, and we've got major commitments from quite a few people, and which we hope will be matched by about $600 million. That $235 million will be matched by about $600 million from mostly development finance institutions, which I think are still the institutions to a large degree investing across the continent. So I think that will catalyze, billions probably in assets across the continent. So
it sounds like you're answering some of Minister Creasy's questions of where does that money come from. You've mentioned philanthropy and DFIs, and Minister, I'll come back to you shortly, but I just wanted to focus on another challenge that we've heard a lot about this morning. Yes, the early stage project development piece and the first loss, but also currency. Now, Ruud, I know what TCX is, but I don't know if this room knows what TCX is. It's a fun acronym, and in the climate space, we know we live in acronym land. So why do you exist? What is TCX? Tell us about how it tackles that critical and pervasive challenge of currency risk.
Well, very happy to do so. Thank you very much for having me. I've been hearing de-risking and currency risk also from Alain several times. And what we see in practice is that many private sector players that are looking at Africa to invest don't want to touch the currency risk. And the currency risk makes many projects unbankable. So their key way to de-risk or to manage currency risk is simply not to invest. That's a way of risk management. You don't take the risk. Now, the purpose in life of TCX is actually take away the currency risk from investments in emerging and frontier markets all over the world and centralize it in one place. So today we run the risk on Vietnamese dong, Honduras lempira, Kenya shilling, Sierra Leone leones. And by having that risk of over more than 70 currencies in one place, you actually have a much better risk profile because the diversification makes it relatively stable. Whereas if someone would invest in Kenya only and run the risk on the Kenya shilling only, you have a high concentration on a single currency. And why that is so crucial if we look at climate finance as scale is actually pretty straightforward. Look at what has been happening with the shilling only in the last 6 months. So Kenya lost 15%, the shilling, of its value against the US dollar. Now this was not mismanagement. This was the combination of the effects from COVID, a war in the Ukraine, increasing food prices, but Kenya was doing exactly what it's supposed to do and was not unique. Pretty much all African countries have been hit either by the war or by food prices or by the global financial crisis, and there's a series of crises in the past 10 years that have all hit emerging market currencies. Now, going back to the example of Kenya, so the 6 months depreciation of 15% in the sovereign debt book led to an increase in shilling of an amount equal to the health and education budget. In 6 months' time, the open exposure in the debt of Kenya, combined with the 15% depreciation, made the debt go up with more than the average of the health and education budget. How can you ever expect a country to be stable, to get higher ratings, to invest long-term in infrastructure to fight climate change, if all the lenders, and these are the official bilateral lenders, the multilateral development banks, the bilateral development banks, if the lenders continue to offload the risk on the borrower, because the borrower is incapable of managing it because they have a concentration. The lender, however, especially if you look at the World Bank, they have a global diversified portfolio and are in a much better position to take on that risk. Now, in return, the interest will not be at 1%, but will be at the Kenyan equivalent, 10, 15. But what you get back for that is you allow your government, your private sector, to actually predict the debt they will have to service next year, in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years. And by doing so, you will finally be allowed to go to in a stable long-term planning, a stable economy, what is crucial to even start investing in large-scale renewable energy projects. So our approach is, if you want to harvest the African sun and you want to harvest the African wind, you have to finance it with African currencies.
Please, Dennis, yeah.
Yeah, I think it is important that we use our own resources for our own development. So it is important that Africa uses these currencies in terms of trading amongst themselves. So what we have done at Afreximbank is to develop a payments and settlement system that enables African countries to use their own currencies when they trade amongst themselves. So you are not exposed to this foreign currency risk. But more importantly, our capital markets are not well developed. So it's very difficult to raise long-term capital on the market. So financial institutions, multilateral development institutions must play a role in developing African capital markets so you can raise long-term funding from the local markets and finance the development that you are looking for using local currencies.
Brilliant. And I know I'm being signaled to wrap this amazing panel up. And what I'll do is actually give everybody their last word, their call to action for the people in this room and who aren't in this room. How do we unlock that capital? Deepening local capital markets obviously being key. But Ruud, I'll start with you and I'll move down the end. So Ruud, your one call to action.
Okay, let me first share our experience because we're trying to generate more private investments. So what we've seen in practice, so all the risk that we have in our books on the most frontier currencies, including, for example, the Sierra Leone, there are private investors out there, US-based European pension funds that are most willing to invest in the currency risk. They do not yet dare to go onshore and face the legal risks, the political risks, etc. What we've always also have seen is parties that start with the currency risk and then it's a bit like they're afraid of the temperature of the African water. They put in a first toe and take the currency risk, and then they realize, hey, it's not that cold. So the risks are not as high as perceived. And then they're willing to take a bath in all the investments that Africa has to offer. So my call to action is, to every borrower in this room, when you are discussing with a financier, check with him, what is your local currency alternative? Don't give me the currency risk if I cannot manage it. What is the alternative you can offer me in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania shilling, in Sierra Leone leones, in Rwandese franc? All of them can be serviced.
Thank you. Dennis, your call to action.
Yes, in order to reduce the cost of funding, we need more concessional financing, more grants. But it is important that institutions such as Afreximbank also put their money there. That's why at Afreximbank we have created a grant fund. We've also created a 500 million concessional finance window, which our shareholders approved at the last annual general meeting. But it is also important to develop capacity even at the governmental levels because you need a transparent policy and regulatory environment for some of these projects to succeed. And we need to build that capacity. Thank you.
Thank you. Mimi.
Yeah, just briefly, I would just say, look, investing in Africa is not an option for any of us. It is for our own survival. I think the innovations that will save the planet, I do believe will come out of this continent. But we need a lot more philanthropic capital, as a lot of people have said on this panel already. Climate finance cannot be financed just with debt alone. So we need a lot more philanthropic capital to come in and really de-risk projects so we can scale.
Thank you, Minister.
Well, as hard as it is to mobilize finance for mitigation efforts, for instance, in the energy sector, it's obviously even harder for adaptation. So I guess my main ask would be that decision makers start to focus more on the adaptation side also, especially when it comes to investing public grants, because we need to spend them wisely and spend them where it's most difficult to get the private money in.
Couldn't agree more, Minister Creasy.
Thank you very much. I suppose the key message is that in order to exploit the opportunities of the continent, we have to address climate finance in the context of our existing finances as a continent, which include the current state of heavily indebtedness, and therefore you can't address climate finance without addressing broader issues of financial reform. And lastly, I would support those on the panel who have said that we do need new and predictable grant financing, but we also need to be able to scale up the very good best practice that we've heard about this morning to get pilot projects to commercial viability by mitigating risks and financing first-of-a-kind projects as well as supporting technical assistance. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Everyone, a big round of applause to this wonderful panel. Guys, I'm so sorry you're stuck with me. It's my job to invite these wonderful speakers off the stage and to invite the next round up. The Australian accent doesn't hold out for much longer, I promise. But it is with great thanks to that panel and with real pleasure to invite the next speakers, the Honourable Dr. Mohamed Amin Adam, Minister of State at the Ministry of Finance in Ghana, to the stage.
Bila shaka mtazamaji, hicho kimekuwa ni kikao ambacho kinaendelea katika kongamano hili la mabadiliko ya tabia nchi, ambapo kikao hicho cha pili kimeweza kukamilika, ambacho kilikuwa kikiendeshwa na Catherine Stoduka ambaye ni mkurugenzi wa Blended Finance Task Force, na kikosi hicho ama kikao hicho vile vile kilikuwa na Barbara Sisi ambaye ni waziri kutoka Afrika Kusini, Dan Johnson ambaye ni waziri kutoka Denmark, na vile vile Rania Almashet ambaye ni waziri kutoka Egypt, Mimi Alemahiu ambaye anatokea katika eneo la Climate Partners ama sekta ya Climate Partners, Alid Disney Denya ambaye alikuwa anatoka katika benki Afrexim, na vile vile Rud Browser ambaye ni mkurugenzi mkuu wa TCX Fund. Basi katika kikao hicho ameweza kuzungumzia masuala kadhaa yakiwemo masuala ya uwekezaji katika sekta ya tabia nchi, vile vile wakisema kuwa ipo haja ya kuweza kuwekeza katika sekta hii ya mabadiliko ya tabia nchi, na vile vile wakisema kuwa pesa zipo. Hivyo basi kinachohitajika ni kuhakikisha kuwa pesa hizi zinaweza kutumika kwa njia ambayo inafaa, na vile vile wakagusia umuhimu wa kuwa na kawi safi katika mataifa, hasa mataifa ambayo ndipo yanaendelea. Vile vile wakasema kuwa kunafaa kuwa na wekezaji katika kuwekeza katika miradi ya dharura. Majanga yanapotokea ndipo kusiwepo kuwa na shida matashishi katika kusuluhisha majanga hayo. Vile vile wakasema kuna haja ya kuweza kuwepo uhamasishaji katika sekta mbalimbali ili kuweza kuhakikisha kuwa pesa zinapoekezwa zinaweza kufanya kazi ambayo inatakikana. Vile vile wameweza kusema kuwa upo umuhimu wa ushirikiano baina ya mataifa ya Afrika, ya bara Afrika, ili kuweza kuhakikisha kuwa uwekezaji huu unafaidi mataifa yote ya barani Afrika.
The temperature rise, going into the future will affect Africa more than anywhere else in the world. I also speak for the V20 group of countries, and we know that 25 out of 68 countries, V20 countries, are most vulnerable when it comes to climate change. But Africa doesn't have the resources, financial resources, to finance adaptation. Also,
mataifa mbalimbali hapa barani Afrika. Basi tuweze kusikiza.
But we are unable to do that because of capital. The leverage financing, such as green and blue bonds, are available. But it's difficult to attract them to Africa for a number of reasons. Number one is that there is no capacity, no expertise to structure leverage financing, particularly high leverage ratio instruments. Apart from this, we have the challenge of lack of harmonized or standardized frameworks, as well as certification processes that will seek to reduce or increase confidence in the investor. And this is why it is difficult to structure high leverage ratio instruments. Another issue affecting financing, climate finance in Africa, is about the cost of capital that was discussed in the earlier panel. But I'd like to add a few points to this. A report commissioned by UN Environment shows that climate vulnerability has already raised the average cost of debt in a sample of developing countries by 170 basis points. And in absolute terms, this translates to about $40 billion additional interest payments over the past 10 years on government debts alone.
Minister, say that again, 40 billion. 40
billion United States dollars in additional interest payments over the last 10 years on only government bonds. If you add the private sector, the figure is very colossal. But blended finance gives hope to address the cost of capital. But that is also challenged in a number of ways. Number one, because of the complexities in structuring blended finance for projects. And number two, the difficulty in aligning the interests of diverse investors. And also, as was mentioned earlier, perceived risk, especially when you are dealing with investors with different levels of risk appetite. And so we need to be able to address the cost of capital. And one way to address this is through the MDBs and regional development banks that have to provide risk guarantees as well as insurance mechanisms so that we can de-risk investments of blended finance to be able to attract private capital to projects. But there's one other issue which really hasn't come to the table for discussion, and that has to do with the macroeconomic environment. Because of high inflation in developed countries and the urgency to address inflation in those countries, they have resorted to monetary tightening through increasing interest rates, and that has led to capital reversals for African countries and for developing countries, making our economies worse, and thereby also increasing the cost of doing business in our economies due to exchange rate risk, etc., etc. So we need to be able to address the issues of macroeconomic stability, and this is why the V20 has been calling for a new deal on climate finance, a new deal that ensures that the IMF and other international financial institutions recognize natural capital assets for carbon exchanges and also for debt repayments. Because when we do this, we will be able to provide macroeconomic stability that is required, an essential requirement for attracting not just capital for adaptation financing and mitigation financing, but capital for the growth of the economy. And so these are, in my view, some of the barriers to attracting climate finance and how we are able to address them in order to attract capital, for example, private capital to climate financing projects in Africa.
Minister, thank you so much. Your clarity around debt, around the complexity of some of these de-risking instruments is spot on. But the idea of the natural capital asset recognition, I wanted to ask, are you getting a lot of support for that?
We are very supportive of this. It's very important because, as the president of Kenya said earlier, we have significant potential in carbon sink. But natural capital accounting is very low and is also not recognized by international financial architecture for debt repayment and also for de-risking capital for climate projects. And so we are very supportive of the need for the world to recognize the natural capital which we have so much in assets in order for us to use that in debt repayment and also to reduce the cost of capital in our continent.
I think it's brilliant, Minister. Thank you. And to pass over to Dr. Monique, I'm very interested in understanding other innovations which have come out of the continent where you are seeing this type of leadership, this type of pioneering around financial innovation, and interested in your reflections.
Thank you so much. The African Union, of course, is driving this vision for the continent of a prosperous, integrated, and peaceful continent, and putting people at the center. So I will start by actually recollecting what we have heard this morning, that Africa is a solutions powerhouse for saving the climate, and that we need to transform all these natural resources into an asset class that investors are actually willing to invest in. And for that, our youthful workforce, our women, our men, our millions of SMEs are just awaiting this opportunity to be given a chance actually to transform the wealth of Africa into an opportunity for growth. And some of the things that we are achieving on the continent is to come stronger as a strong continent, speaking with one voice and having that audience in the global arena. I'm seeing that happening a lot. And I'm seeing us coming up with frameworks, normative frameworks, that we need our member states to domesticate more. I don't want to give the details because my sister, Commissioner Josepha, earlier this morning, have highlighted some of those frameworks. But we need to continue really speaking with one voice, especially when it comes to making sure climate finance works for us. The African Union has organized itself into 3 commissioners when it comes to, into commissions when it comes to climate issues. We have the Congo Basin Commission, we have a commission for island states, and we have a commission for the Sahel. We are seeing more and more cohesion getting on board within those commissions. And this is something that we needed to encourage because, sincerely, no single country will make it alone. We have to get together, stick strong together, and the African Union institutions, the Commission, the organs, the Pan-African Development Financial Institutions, the regional economic communities, we all need to come together and support our member states. We need to put our expertise together. So that is the effort that the African Union Commission is driving to coordinate all this capacity we have on the continent. We have a risk capacity, we have the AEDB, we have a Flexing Bank. All of these, we should really make it work for our member states. Then I'm seeing also progress in corporate and economic and political governance. You know that we have APRM. We are trying really to improve on this ground. Of course, progress here, but also challenges there. This is something that we need to enhance so that we have transparency and accountability prevail. I'm seeing also African Union and its institutions getting stronger and stronger. And this is a call from me to our partners to trust us more. And also a call to our member states to empower us more so that we can support this one Africa's position. Because as I said, no one country is able to make it alone. So it's through empowering these structures that our member states have put in place. They are contributing into those structures. So we need this to be pursued even more. Last but not least, I'm seeing really that taking ownership to invest in infrastructure. This is one area we still have a long way to go. But again, we have a strong architecture for that. We have PIDA, we have other instruments. My sister Commissioner Amanish is there. She's driving that for the continent. But we need really to keep doing more of that so that we can unlock potential on our continent. Maybe I stop here. I may come back when you call me. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And the point of cohesion is very inspiring to be here today. You asked for trust and support from partners, and I wonder that's a very nice segue to go to you, Jennifer, because of course we know that Germany has looked to align its international financial flows with a Paris climate agenda, and so I wanted to get your reflections on this conversation.
Yeah, it's very, very important that we value partnerships and partnerships that are mutually respectful. We have Agenda 2063, which is anchoring all that we are doing on the continent. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And it's from this agenda that other frameworks that are sectoral in nature are deriving and actually declining in more details what is meant by that. We are now evaluating the 10 years of what we have achieved within that agenda. We are coming up with the next 10 years plan, which is going to be having also a costing framework. We are reviewing into our flagship projects, of which projects like Inga Dam and others in this area are prominent. So we want all the considerations to be aligned to that. And also we want the financing to channel through African institutions. We have our African Development Bank, that is an implementing agency of the Union. We have a Flexim Bank and many others in the regional blocks that we need to unlock this financing through the same. Again, we need the African Union to take agency of all of that discussion and consolidating the African Union voice. We don't think that parallel systems are going to help us. So that's what we are talking in terms of alignment. Thank you.
Brilliant. And you mentioned not reinventing the wheel. And I know, Jennifer, that's something that you have looked at, scaling what works. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, first of all, just a huge congratulations to the African Union and to Kenya for this amazing conference. I'm so excited and privileged to be here. And I think you mentioned trust. I think trust comes through action, not just words. And I think in Germany we are trying to do our part in that, whether it be through our own climate finance, whether it be through things like the Green Climate Fund and increasing our contribution there and hoping that others come along. But also in listening to the panel earlier and what Minister Creasy said about needing to do climate finance in the context of the African context of financing. So another instrument that has been mentioned a little bit is on debt swaps. And so actually here at the conference, Germany's announcing that we are doing a climate debt swap with Kenya for 60 million euros, and they will have that funding to be able to invest in sustainable agriculture, in renewable energy for Kenya. And I think that's an example of the type of thing we need to do, a small contribution on that. Also on the de-risking, and I just, everything that was said from His Honorable Minister from Ghana on the de-risking and the reform side of things as well. I think Germany's trying to move forward there. One piece that maybe I can contribute, which is a little different, is on kind of what are the signals that investors are needing. So, we need to be looking, and we are looking much more actively in the cost of capital and the de-risking and the guarantees, and I'm so interested in listening to what specifically is needed, because we need to get all the different instruments. I think that's part of the complexity, right, is to be looking at the goal and then the different instruments. But our experience in Germany on the renewable side, for example, is that by having long, loud legal signals and policies in place, that has been what has been driving the investment in. So I think what President Ruto put forward in his speech this morning, but other countries that have put those in place and are putting those in place, I think that will also assist along with these financial instruments, because that will then give the private sector the confidence that they can stay. So those are some of the areas that we're working on, and I have to depart quickly. Look for an exciting announcement from President Ruto briefly, so I'm going to go listen in on that. Thank you so much, though.
Thank you, Jennifer. Pleasure to have you with us. Just to make the segue, I know that we've got the Minister from Namibia in the front row here as well, and I understand Germany has been looking at Namibian green hydrogen, and that is an example of what you just said, so great. Made the segue. Now, Minister, you referred earlier to this challenge and complexity of these de-risking instruments. We know that, Baholo, you've obviously called for better blended finance, and you've looked at this in a context of investment and trade, and I'd love to understand what you think we need here to scale up better blended finance and unlock the capital that we're talking about.
Thanks, Catherine. It was interesting earlier, we had a conversation about successful countries in attracting climate finance, and in my opinion, there hasn't been any success for an African country in attracting climate finance. And I say this because if we look at the 2020 figures, collectively, the continent only attracted, I think it's about 30 billion out of a total of $940 billion that was climate finance in the world. And that's only 11 or 12% of what the continent needs in order to adequately invest in NDCs or any other climate finance projects in the continent. So if we're looking at the gap that exists in finance, we cannot rightfully say that there has been a success in attracting climate finance in the continent. But that said, going back to your question of, what needs to be done and how can we ensure that we are attracting finance, there is another controversial statement that says it doesn't matter what we do. Finance will flow where it feels most at home, and this conversation, I found it quite controversial in London, where a financier said, we do not know anyone in Africa, so we're not going to invest in the continent. And this takes us back to decades long of work we've done in investment attraction, along the lines of the World Investment Report or along the lines of the Doing Business Report. We're doing all of the enabling environment reforms, and many African countries have come up with these and still is trailing in relation to investment attraction to Southeast Asia versus maybe even Latin America in some cases. And when we go back to it, investors say it's an issue of risk, right? So in thinking about how do we reduce risk, the previous panel spoke to this, and in addition to that, I wanted to say perhaps for member states, central governments, private investors, public investors to work towards consolidating a credit risk-sharing mechanism and sharing the data that exists. We know what Afrexim is doing. We know AFC is here. They are thriving. They are somehow managing to reduce the risk that is associated with investing in the continent, and therefore could share that data and information with international financiers so they are more comfortable with investing in the continent. We have AAA rated institutions, to Madam DCP's point, that should be used to channel investment into the continent. So I don't think just going back to the issue of let's create an enabling environment as we've been doing for decades, and yet we haven't received the right investment attraction is the only way to go. But in addition to that, I think specifically for climate finance, we've been looking at NDCs and looking at the enhanced transparency framework, and countries that have made some strides have ensured that the NDCs are closely linked to investment plans. and that the investment plans are very clear, and they are creating space for private sector, and they are making space for, through credit enhancement, for the private sector to feel that there's a reduced political risk, but also reduced project financing risk. So project origination is a very important thing to do, and to that end I want to plug a project that we've been working on under the leadership of the UNDSG and the COP27 climate champion, Dr. Mahmoud, he's somewhere here. We did the UN Compendium of Climate Projects to prove that there are climate projects in the continent that can enable not only green industries, but can ensure that there's development. So policy needs to show that interconnectedness if we are to attract the right impact climate finance in the continent.
I want to come back to this sort of sense of frustration, actually. You've had a request, strengthen enabling environment, include these policies, set these NDCs, commit to transition plans, and you're still saying that people, investors, will not deploy capital because of the perception of risk. Did I hear you correctly?
Yes. In some part. I mean, it's a frustration. It's not necessarily to say there's no progress, but we need a complete overhaul of the global financial infrastructure. And this is a conversation that I know is being had quite widely. You know, we need to see different IFIs and MDBs playing their role in creating space and showing that this perceived risk that has been associated with the continent is actually false, because default rates are not as high as they have been put out to be. There is data on this, I just don't happen to have it at the moment, but there is data that points to this. And I certainly think if you look at, say, default rates in Latin America, they're higher than for the continent, and yet the attraction of climate investment in 2020 for the Americas from the private sector sits at 49%, while for the continent is only 14%.
Well, it's wonderful that Secretary Kerry could hear that challenge as well around really the over-perception of risk, because I know he's pioneering a number of these blended instruments to tackle that risk. And it is my privilege to invite our private sector voice on this panel to weigh in. How are you looking at the continent? What does this conversation of risk feel like? And are you thinking about opportunities when you look at different countries here?
Sure. I mean, a lot has been said, and more eloquently than I could have, so I've torn up my notes, and I'm going to speak ad hoc. Let me start by telling you who Helios is. Helios is one of Africa's largest focused private equity funds. We've been around for 20 years. We've invested $4 billion of equity and raised about $5 billion of debt over that period. We've invested and built businesses in sectors ranging from agriculture, consumer goods, telecom, infrastructure, real estate to fintechs. Along the journey, we have actually monetized a whole range of international capital through dividend recaps, high financings, refinancings, green bonds, real estate investment trust structures. We've sold to multinationals, we've sold to foreign private equity funds. We've actually listed 3 of our businesses, African businesses, on the FTSE 250. So we've mobilized at the end of the journey, once we've built companies of scale, real international capital at scale. So that's, I think, who we are and what we do. And on the climate front, we've done quite a bit. We've been a big investor in seeds, fertilizers, so a lot on the agricultural front, vertically integrated consumer goods companies. We built Africa's largest commercial and industrial energy business called Starsight, which is now about 400 megawatts of solar and battery power across a range of countries. So we've done a lot of innovative things in climate. That's Helios, and we've delivered returns, risk-adjusted, attractive for our investors, and our investors are a whole range of local and international capital, global, DFIs and commercial. through delivered returns and high impact. And by impact, I think in the past we looked at it always as gender, jobs, carbon mitigation, etc., and financial inclusion. As we look forward, and we'll take a step back actually, before I look forward. Take a step back and just look at where the global market is. We've had, what creates policy change? You need awareness first, then you need planning, and then you need action. And there's a lot of frustration because the awareness comes and goes, the planning comes and goes, and the action is sporadic. And I keep hearing that as we sort of flop from COP to COP. But I think the awareness is going up. If you just think about the fact that in California today, houses are uninsurable. You've just had a massive tragedy in Hawaii. So awareness it's no longer Africa is vulnerable, and Africa is really in need of adaptation help and investment. I think this is a serious problem everywhere. And climate change knows no borders. I think that is becoming very apparent to the Americans and to Europeans. So I think that's really important. I saw that, last 3 days, I was in Singapore on Friday, I was in Doha on Saturday, I was in London yesterday, and I'm back here today. This is really on the front of everybody's agenda. And Africa, why is Africa important within this context? If climate change is becoming important for everybody, and it's becoming and really emblazoned for everybody, well, all of the good work that we're doing in Europe and in the US around our decarbonization efforts will frankly be negated if we do not actually decouple Africa's growth from emissions. And Africa today sits pretty much where India and China were 10 or 15 years ago, and their growth has led to a multiplier effect on emissions. If Africa goes in the same direction, it's going to negate all of the other good efforts that we're doing elsewhere in the world. So it's really critical that we face this problem and tackle it. And Africa has a distinct advantage because it is 10 or 15 years behind China. It actually doesn't have the legacy infrastructure and the shackles of that infrastructure to tackle. So it's actually it's sitting at a really interesting point in the cost/technology curve. So solar and battery powers is cost efficient and cost effective. And it's almost, the analogy I always use, it's like leapfrogging landlines and just going straight to mobile telephony, which Africa is very familiar with, India is very familiar with. It's the same here. Why build out grid infrastructure, which is expensive, hard to finance? We've talked about guarantees. Why build out infrastructure that is really, really hard when there are actually cost-effective solutions like commercial C&I products, etc., which could have multiple use cases? So I think that's why Africa is so interesting for us from a climate perspective. Then looking forward, what's our strategy as a private investor? Well, we want to deliver attractive risk-adjusted returns with a very high focus on mitigation and adaptation. So actually working with Catherine and her firm, we've come up with a very detailed process by which we measure ourselves. So evaluate an investment on what it's going to deliver vis-a-vis mitigation and adaptation, assess, monitor, report, etc. All the while doing what we usually do on the commercial side, which is investing in businesses that feel like they're at the right point for explosive growth, where we can play a really catalytic role in that growth, and then exit at good returns for us. What's going to be helpful for us from policymakers and investors around the world? Well, number one, coherent and consistent policy, both local and global. And on the local front, I think President Ruto has made a great start with the setting up the planning commission effectively for electric vehicles. I think you need to plan very carefully because you need a lot of dominoes to fall into place for that to work effectively. And then on a global level, for the carbon markets to really be thought through very carefully over the next year and a half, and established so that our countries can benefit. And we've talked a lot about natural resources. And the second is We'd like to see more local currency and local capital coming into investments, either alongside us or potentially even exiting to them. In Kenya alone, I think the PFAs, the pension funds, are sitting on about $13 billion of capital. And very little of that is actually going into real estate or private equity or growth investments or infrastructure. A lot of it is sitting in treasuries. So some sort of policy impact to push that into riskier investments, perhaps with the aid of businesses like InfraCredit, and I know I saw Chinua somewhere in the crowd who runs that business. So I think there's a lot being done, but we can move faster and better. And then I think for investors, what I'd ask is, Africa, when you think about risk and people talk about perceived risks, Africa is not just one country, it's many, many countries. And what you want to be doing when you're looking at exposing yourself to what is an attractive market in the right markets, businesses that have the potential to scale, is you want the right partner to be alongside you. And that's kind of our strategy and our approach to climate and on the continent.
It's good to know we've talked about partnerships so much on this panel. We are over time, and so I would like to cede my closing remarks to Minister Adam. And you've heard from the private sector that there is advantage and opportunity here. You've got Secretary Kerry in the room, you've had Jennifer Morgan from Germany, we had Minister Jorgensen from Denmark. What's your call to action? You've got the final word. Over to you.
Well, I want to address the issue of coherent and consistent policies, which we have been told is a requirement to attract investment to climate projects. But that cannot be true for all countries, because a number of countries have embarked on reforms, far-reaching reforms, to attract capital, particularly to renewable energy mitigation financing. Ghana, for example, has a policy on mandatory obligatory purchase for power projects that are produced from renewable sources. There are other countries that have feed-in tariffs just to incentivize the price incentives to attract investment. There are other countries that have competitive procurement frameworks so that a level playing field is provided for investors to compete. But in spite of all this, these countries are not attracting the investment. IRENA estimates that $2.2 trillion are moving around the world looking for renewable investment, but only 55 billion came to Africa. And the reason is inconsistent policy. Yet there are so many countries that have consistent policies, coherent policies, but they are still not attracting the investment. The issue raised about having the right partner by you is true, and that is what is also contributing to the perceived risk. So when Ghana has all the right policies, and then next door is Burkina Faso, which is suffering from political instability, then you have Mali around, and then Niger also coming along. Political instability in countries around you will help to deepen the perception of risk in countries, even when those countries have the right policies. And this is why African countries need to collaborate. We need to share notes. We need to share knowledge on how we all can help to build a regional policy environment that is enabling for investment. If we don't do this, we will continue to be denied of the right investment to support the growth of our energy infrastructure and other climate resilient infrastructure that we very much need. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the wonderful panelists. I think we're over time, so we're running off the stage, but thank you again for listening. It's been a wonderful morning. Thank you.
story and show ourselves in all our splendor and glory. Yeah. Let's come together now to bring down all barriers for a greater tomorrow. So Africa, arise. Let us all arise. Start to be counted. Arise. Let us all arise. We are part of the solution. Part of the solution. We are part of the solution. Woo. Part of the solution. We are part of the solution. I am part of the solution. We are part of the solution. Woo. Part of the solution. Africa, yeah. Africa, yeah.
Thank you so much to the panel and the moderator, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for staying in your seats. But can we give them a bigger round of applause for what they did up here? And I think excellent conversations. I'm just going to highlight three things. We need a complete overhaul of the global financial system. There is a perception versus reality battle that Africa needs to fight. And finally, we need local and global, coherent and consistent policies. There's a lot of work to be done. I'm happy to introduce the next panel session, where we're going to be delving into Africa's expanded role in voluntary carbon markets. We're going to look at how do we accelerate Africa's carbon credit supply, amplify its delivery from a mere 2% to potential of 40% by 2030 as well. And to drive this conversation, I want us to give a very warm welcome to William Asiko, the Vice President, Africa of the Rockefeller Foundation. Thank you. Over to you, William.
Well, good afternoon. As you heard, my name is William Asiko, and I am the Vice President for the Rockefeller Foundation for Africa, and it gives me great pleasure to be the Program Director for this session on carbon markets. I think we've heard many times today that Africa is at an inflection point. We've heard in the previous session how difficult it is for Africa to access finance for its development and energy transition. That Africa has a perceived risk that is higher than other regions of the world that have higher default rates on loans than we do. We have heard that Africa is at the center of calling for global financial architecture reform, largely because that architecture is in the hands of people outside of Africa. Today, we are going to talk about a financial instrument that is in our hands as Africans, that we can control, that we can determine the speed and the scale at which it grows. And that's why it gives me great pleasure to moderate or to be the program director of this session of carbon markets for the Global South. Now, carbon markets, like any other market, requires the development of a whole ecosystem so that the value chain can produce the results that are desired. And today's session will bring together speakers who will talk to each part of the ecosystem that is required to make carbon markets for the Global South successful. And we will focus on the African Carbon Markets Initiative. That is an initiative that has been launched right here in Africa and that is working today to develop carbon markets. So today, we have very distinguished speakers who will speak to partnerships, who will speak to intermediaries, market intermediaries, who will speak to the private sector, and who will speak to different parts of the ecosystem that are required to build carbon markets today. And we will introduce them as they come on stage. So let me talk a little bit about this market called carbon markets. Carbon markets are an innovative solution that can play an important role in the global journey to net zero. They facilitate the sale of credits and emissions for emissions that are removed or avoided by a project to other parties. Companies, governments, individuals buy these credits to neutralize or offset for the emissions as they transition to net zero. And they typically buy these credits at a lower cost than reducing their emissions directly. As a result, the appetite for carbon credits is growing, as you can see in the slide behind me. Global voluntary carbon markets have grown significantly over the past decade, and Africa's voluntary market has grown 36% annually over the past 5 years. In 2021 alone, the market grew to a high of over $120 million in retirements. So carbon markets do present a tremendous opportunity for Africa. The technical potential of African-sourced carbon credits is substantial. It is estimated at up to 2.4 million tons of carbon dioxide, worth up to $50 billion annually by 2030. Realizing that potential, though, would deliver material benefits. Africans could mitigate climate change, protect critical ecosystems, and fund sustainable development for the region. Indeed, we could help our fellow Africans access clean energy and cooking, healthy food, invest in sustainable agriculture, pay for universal school feeding, and all of that would create millions of jobs. And beyond the continent, Africa can become a global leader. Our carbon markets can serve as a template for others across the Global South and accelerate the transfer of financing from high-income countries to low- and middle-income countries. However, even with the growth we have seen over the past 5 years, the continent is currently producing less than 2% of the maximum annual technical potential. For this reason, the Rockefeller Foundation, Sustainable Energy for All, and the Global Alliance for People and Planet created the African Carbon Markets Initiative, or ACME for short, to help realize the potential of voluntary carbon markets for Africa. ACME's mission is to drive a 20-fold increase in the production of verified African carbon credits while ensuring that their proceeds are transparently and equitably distributed. The integrity of carbon credits is central to this mission and ensures Africa can reliably meet the rising demand for credits. We believe that though there are plenty of global interests in individual schemes in different African nations, no umbrella organization exists to interact with and objectively represent African actors across the entire carbon market value chain, let alone uphold the integrity of traded credits. We set up ACME to fill that role, to serve as an umbrella organization to scale carbon markets run by Africans situated in Africa and representing African interests in the global market. ACME generated a lot of interest when we launched it at COP27, and I am pleased to report that we have made remarkable progress since then. We have engaged more than 20 countries, 6 of which are on the brink of starting work to develop their carbon market infrastructure with ACME's support. The first of those is right here in Kenya, which worked with ACME partners USAID and CEDA to develop the country's carbon market regulatory infrastructure. We are also generating demand for African carbon credits. Major global companies, including Standard Chartered, Vertree, ETG, and Nando's, have signed advanced market signals with a total value of $200 million. And I am pleased to say that in just a few moments, another major amount will be announced right here on this stage. 3 international exchanges and auction houses, for example, the Intercontinental Exchange, ICE, which owns the New York Stock Exchange, are prepared to host auctions of African carbon credits with a great green auction plan for COP28 in December. ACME is working to sign memorandums of understanding with major financiers, such as Standard Chartered, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and FSD, to collaborate on financial mechanisms to increase capital flows into African carbon credit production projects. And we are drafting an inaugural carbon credit showcase, which will drive transparency across Africa's carbon credit supply by representing 92 projects from 63 developers across 23 countries. And along the way, as I mentioned, we have prioritized integrity. Standards and integrity leaders, such as Gold Standard, ICVCM, BCMI, are prepared to put their own resources into collectively delivering on ACME's goals. That will include exploring the development of new methodologies in collaboration with ACME. We are indeed proud of the progress we have made as ACME, and we are going to celebrate that progress today. But we know we still have a long way to go, which will be another focus of our discussions today. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker of the day, and I do have the honor of introducing the United States Special Presidential Envoy for Climate and former Secretary of State, John Kerry. And as he comes up, let me just say that Secretary Kerry is here to give remarks on the Energy Transition Accelerator, or ETA, an inclusive, multi-stakeholder climate finance platform to advance the global energy transition. Welcome, Secretary Kerry.
Thank you, William. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon to all, and thank you very much for this particular session and also for all of the preparations that have gone into this summit. I want to put the idea of expanding a carbon market squarely on your priority agenda today for a number of reasons. But I want to begin by thanking all of you who have come together for this African summit, which is critical for many reasons, not the least of which is Africa is the home to the place where, of 20 countries most affected by the climate crisis, 17 are here in Africa. And so getting this right is perhaps even more meaningful to people who are not responsible for the crisis itself. And I want to make clear to everyone here that President Biden and those of us in the United States are particularly sensitive to this. It is impossible to have a just transition, which you hear from the mouths of public people all the time. It is impossible to have that just transition if there's no justice in what is happening on a daily basis to the lives of people most affected by the crisis. And so it is clear that if people are getting in small boats and drowning in the Mediterranean, or moving across borders and running into conflict zones that cost them their lives, there are so many different ways in which what is unfolding on this planet is a fundamental abuse of basic human rights. And I think all of us need to factor that in together with one other thing, not a minor thing. What is happening to our planet today, causing this remarkable disruption all around the planet, whether it's floods that are unimaginable repeatedly, or fires burning in places that they didn't burn, or sea level rise that is threatening the destruction of whole nation states, or vulnerable countries that are most negatively impacted, like Bangladesh and others, because of their low-lying status. All of these are confrontations to our humanity, for the simple reason that this issue today is in fact one of the most dangerous issues in all of human history. That's not exaggeration in any way whatsoever. This is human created because of the way we decide to heat our homes, light our buildings, travel, because we are unwilling to enforce fundamental laws that we have adopted about deforestation, illegal logging, and other things. It's a human-created problem, but it's also subject to human resolution. And I want to emphasize to everybody here that what is happening today is not a surprise. Everything happening today was predicted 30 years, 35 years ago or more. Jim Hansen, a scientist in NASA, stood up and told us climate change is here. That was 1988. We gathered in Rio in 1992. We passed a framework, which we are still working with in the context of the UN. This is about to be the 28th COP. But how many more? How many COPs do we need to understand how simple this fundamental problem really is? Which is the willingness of people to continue to burn fossil fuel without capturing the emissions and without regard to the other technologies that are available today to be able to make a difference. So, my friends, humanity is threatened by humanity itself. And the question is, are we going to wake up this year and make the difference that we know we can make? Now, how does all of what I just said fit into the idea of a carbon market? Well, I'll tell you. We face today, in this massive growth of destruction that is taking place on the planet, we face the possibility that we are reaching or have reached something called tipping points. And tipping points are what the scientists tell us will happen to the planet if we do not move fast enough to reduce emissions, if we do not stay on the Paris-aligned track, the track to try to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius alive as a goal. Now, in our efforts to keep it alive as a goal, we have learned through the folks who have spent a lifetime reading the models, listening to what's happening, looking at what's happening, understanding what our response is needed. They have decided that by 2030 we need a 45% minimum reduction in the emissions of the planet. That's a scientifically arrived at conclusion, not political, not ideological, scientific. Math, physics, chemistry. And what's happening is people are choosing instead to ignore those basic laws and facts of physics and science and mathematics. And so we're told that possibly we're at 5 tipping points: a tipping point in the Arctic, a tipping point in the Antarctic, tipping point in the coral reefs of the ocean, tipping point in the permafrost, which releases massive amounts of methane, tipping point in the Barents Sea ice. Now, I don't know if we're there or not. Nobody can tell you for certainty. But when you're told this is a threat, it's our responsibility to listen to it. So as I have traveled in Africa and other countries in the world, other places, other continents, I meet with presidents and finance ministers and environment ministers, and I say, what do we have to do? We have to reduce the emissions. How fast? This way. How do we do that? Well, to do it, we have to deploy the alternatives. We have to respond to the reality of what is called pollution. That's what greenhouse gases are. They're pollution. It kills 15 million people a year, every year. 8 million, excuse me, that's a different figure, but 8 million people die because of the lack of quality air. Millions of people are now dying because of extreme heat. People are moving because of extreme heat. The world is going to feel tensions that have yet to be fully felt and fully defined. But my point to all of you today with respect to a carbon market is this. Every person I sit with in a position of responsibility to be able to say, let's make a difference, let's reduce those emissions, we need your help. We need money. We've been told by the various reports of the UN and others that we need about $4 to $4.5 trillion every year for the next 30 years. And as you all know, we've had a problem trying to find 100 billion since Paris. So here's what I've concluded personally. I don't think any government in the world has those trillions of dollars that they're just going to throw out there and help us be able to do what we have to do to deploy the renewable energy, to discover the new energies of the future and do what we have to do. Even though we're doing an amazing amount on about 1.7 trillion that's now out there in currency. Much of it chasing green hydrogen, new battery storage, direct air carbon capture, a whole lot of ways in which we can make smart decisions. But we need more money. Now, unfortunately, the idea of a carbon market was sullied to some degree in some quarters because people decided that they were going to abuse it. And so you did have some abuse, where you didn't have strict enough environmental guidelines or strict enough guardrails for how something would be credited and how the market would work. But that doesn't mean it can't be done. It just means it wasn't done by some people who are willing to abuse it. And so in some places it has actually worked effectively. Sulfur, you don't hear about acid rain today because sulfur is a marketplace and it trades. And as a result, the sulfur problem has been reduced. So I want to share a couple of thoughts today about this. The leaders I meet, particularly in Africa, express their desire to get to net zero earlier. But they all say finance is missing. We need more money. We need what's known as concessionary funding. Why do we need concessionary funding? Because that money will behave differently from those trillions that come from large financial institutions, where they have a fiduciary responsibility to produce a profit for the owners of that money. But we still want that money to deploy. So we have to take the risk. You heard earlier about risk. You have to reduce the risk that an investor looks at and sees and says, I'm not going to do that deal because I don't see how I'm going to make any money. I'm not going to put my money on the line. And the way you can de-risk is by getting concessionary funding on the table through a number of things. Government can allocate some, or, and that's hard today, you don't find a lot of people putting the kind of the big money you need on the table, or you can get it through philanthropy. And philanthropists are willing to put up money. We're working with the Bezos Foundation, and we're working with the Rockefeller Foundation to help find some amount of money to help leverage. But in the end, we believe that a working marketplace where people are deciding voluntarily to buy a credit because that credit will allow them to temporarily, not forever, reduce their actual reduction if they need to. And there are some people who need to today. Let me give you an example. There are big companies that have reduced their emissions. They've done their scope 1, scope 2. They're getting down there. They got about 10, 15, 20% to go, but they can't get there. Just physically can't get there because there's no market yet sufficiently big for electric vehicles, or there's no capacity there yet for a smart grid, which would then reduce their emissions even more. So what do? Just quit and go home? No. If they could buy a credit, and that credit could be applied against, in our case, in the we have created something called the Energy Transition Accelerator. We announced it at Sharm el-Sheikh last year, and we are working with the new World Bank president now, Ajay Banga, to unlock additional billions in financing. And we recently launched the Blended Finance for Energy Transition Initiative to demonstrate how effectively public capital can leverage private investment. But carbon markets, we also think, has an important role to play here. And the market approaches first championed by the United States are now officially embraced by the UN process. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement says it lays the foundation for a high-integrity carbon market in line with the Paris Agreement. And to meet the Paris goal of keeping 1.5 degrees Celsius alive as a limit in the warming of the planet, I believe, and others believe, we need the carbon market more than ever. So I am really excited to see the enthusiasm that William was just talking about being shown in Africa for a carbon trading mechanism. With leadership from the African Carbon Markets Initiative, countries are positioning themselves to participate fully in a growing market, which will help to meet the climate and the development challenges at the same time. And I look forward to hearing over these 2 days about the progress ACMI is making. We also look forward to working together, we, the United States, with the ETA, want to work with the African Climate Market Initiative. But we think Africa can benefit and the Global South can benefit only if the carbon market grows. It's got to grow. You heard a mention of about 121 million. This market has to become a market in the billions in order to work effectively. And for that, we need to ensure the environmental integrity of this market. This is critical, not only to protect the climate, but also to create a thriving market, because people won't take the risk either of getting involved in a market that doesn't have the right standards and guidelines. So I hear again and again from CEOs, they're only interested in carbon credits if they are of the highest quality. And this has been a fundamental premise of multi-stakeholder forest carbon programs that we've supported, like the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility and the Biocarbon Fund Initiative for Sustainable Forest Landscapes. And African countries have been the leaders in verifying emissions reductions at a scale and generating credits. And the LEAF Coalition, many of you may be familiar with it, under which a number of African countries are eligible for these reductions. So, my friends, at COP27, I joined with Raj Shah of the Rockefeller Foundation and Andrew Steer of the Bezos Earth Fund to introduce the Energy Transition Accelerator. And through this, we hope to leverage carbon markets to help accelerate the clean energy transition in developing countries. We are building a Paris-aligned program. That means a program that will try to keep faith with the 1.5 degree limit. And I'm proud to tell you that in the U.S. today, with a combination of the IRA and our current rate of transition, we are seeing a major shift in the allocation of people's efforts in producing energy. 90% of our new energy is now coming from renewables, and we expect that to continue into the future. We are building a Paris-aligned effort across the board, and rather than crediting one project over here and another project over there, we're trying to build and reward a country for emission reductions that come about in the entire power sector. We want to be jurisdictional, not just project-oriented. And that could happen through the early retirement of coal, through accelerated deployment of renewables, new transmission or storage, or changes in government policy. And to anyone here who might say, well, wait a minute now, you know, someone's going to fudge this, or there's going to be a problem with it. Let me just be very clear to everybody. We want this credit to only be available to some company that wants to buy it if it is for the specific purpose of a project that reduces emissions, closing a coal-fired coal plant, or building out renewables. One or the other, or both. Now, for people who say, well, what about the holding it accountable? Folks, if you're closing a coal plant, it's pretty easy to see it happen and to know whether it's functioning or not.
engages communities, marrying the latest science with the community's own knowledge of their situation so they can shape their own solutions and their own response to the climate crisis. In that vein, it is truly the best of both worlds. It works very simply. There are two grants that FLOCA gives. One is to county governments to help build their capacity to work with the communities to assess the risk and prioritize their investments in resilience. And then the second is a larger grant to help finance those actions at the local level. So we are delighted that the first assessment and action plans have now been delivered by 44 of Kenya's counties. And today we will be launching the first investment grants for all of them. This is a terrific achievement. And of course, Kenya aims to be a model for other countries, and that is exactly what we're seeing with FLOCA. This has become a powerful and a vital model, even in its infancy, to engage the most vulnerable people and to inspire other countries to learn and perhaps adapt for their own use. I believe that's why His Excellency, the President of Sierra Leone, is here. We know there's also interest from Somalia and Tanzania, and I want to acknowledge the presence of our Vice President for Eastern and Southern Africa, Victoria Kwakwa, who is here so we can help expand the word of what has happened here to our other clients. So in short, FLOCA is a wonderful achievement for Kenya. It is a wonderful model for others. And in a way, it is misnamed. It's true, it does finance locally led action, but I think much more important at the local level, it is engaging, entrusting, and empowering the local level to play its full part in responding to the needs and opportunities of climate. So it's an honor to be here today. Thank you.
A round of applause again for Kate. Mr. President, the FLOCA program is a cornerstone in our commitment to boost our locally led climate action efforts. And that is why, as mentioned, there will be goodies to the county governments on the FLOCA program, and that's why most of the governors are here. Your Excellency, allow me now to invite Dr. Pape Kofler, the Parliamentary State Secretary of the Federal Minister of Economic Cooperation and Development of the Republic of Germany. Welcome.
Excellencies, I think all protocol observed in the sake of time. Thank you very much for the invitation here to Nairobi. We are very happy to be here with my colleague from the Foreign Minister, Jennifer Morgan, together to represent our government, Germany, and participate in that very important event here. Well, we heard that Kenya is very ambitious in defining its own national climate targets. Started a few years ago, but now you were updating your national determined contributions, and that underlines really the role that Kenya is a regional champion for renewable energy. I want to congratulate you on that point. Well, your country is becoming a climate action leader on the continent, and we are also very happy in Germany that Kenya has joined the Climate Club. We welcome very much that the Kenyan government has published its first long-term strategy. This is an important instrument for channeling investment into priority sectors. And that Kenya's National Climate Change Action Plan spells out the goals of the LTS and the NDCs in a really concrete manner, because at the end of the day, implementation is the crucial moment. We are happy as Germany that we are here and able to support Kenya's efforts to draft those strategies. That effort has been based on a multi-sector approach which has involved country governments, civil society and private sector. And I think the civil society engagement you've shown as Kenyan was very exceptional and should be underlined, because that was an event where more than 280 young Kenyans participated, and they were building up their capacities to work on climate change as an important topic for the next generation. I would like to use this opportunity to congratulate Kenyan government on that effort especially. At COP27, Germany signed a roadmap for launching a climate and development partnership with Kenya. The Kenyan-German partnership will focus on mitigation, especially increased generation of renewable energy and support for electric vehicle transport, and adaptation. with a focus on improving the resilience of agricultural structures and agricultural systems. Germany is providing active support to Kenya in the following areas: increased renewable energy generation. Together we want to improve regulatory environment for green hydrogen production, and we want to enhance fertilizer production on the basis of green hydrogen. Kenyan-made green fertilizer is the goal. And in order to increase the resilience of local communities, we are also supporting climate change adaptation in the agricultural sector. Since early this year, we have been funding via KfW and together with the other partners presented here today, the nationwide financing locally led climate action, FLOCA, as it was pointed out here, and our contribution will be 31 million euros to that program. Well, Your Excellency, President Ruto, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at this climate summit, Kenya and Africa lead the way. Germany is keen to support the ambitious policies and also takes on the responsibility to implement ambitious climate goals at home in Germany and in our responsibility also in the European Union. Asante sana.
Thank you so much. A round of applause. Allow me, Your Excellency, to welcome Her Excellency Anne Waiguru, the Chairperson of the Council of Governors, to make her remarks. Her leadership, Your Excellency, has been instrumental in ensuring that counties create climate change action plans that shape the National Climate Change Action Plan, the successful implementation of the Financing Locally Led Action Plan, and also the impressive uptake of the participatory climate risk assessment development by counties. Welcome, Governor.
Your Excellency, Dr. William Samoei Ruto, President of the Republic of Kenya and Commander-in-Chief of the Defense Forces, Your Excellency, Julius Maada Bio, President of Sierra Leone, Your Excellency Rigathi Gachagua, Deputy President of the Republic of Kenya, and Your Excellency Nangolo Mbumba, Vice President of Namibia, representatives of the African Union and regional affiliated organizations, Cabinet Secretaries present, Principal Secretaries, development partners, all delegates and distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Before I make my remarks, Your Excellency, allow me to recognize the presence of governors who are present today here during this forum. May I request them to please stand up. Let's acknowledge them. Thank you very much. The launch of various policy financing instruments today is a significant milestone to not only Kenya, that celebrates a two-level system of governance, but also a benchmark to African nations and the globe in our collective journey towards driving green growth and climate finance solutions for Africa and the world. This opportunity displays progress, determination, ambition, agility in climate action, harnessing together our efforts from a locally adaptation approach. Subnational governments as institutions envisaged as drivers of transformative service delivery at the local level are in the forefront to deliver a catalyzed low-carbon economy and sustainable development. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a decade old, all the county governments have enacted and implemented the requisite policy and legal climate change frameworks that anchor various processes and structures to galvanize climate action at the local level. This includes the county climate change funds, a ring-fenced financing model for climate action. In the financial year 2023-2024, the counties have cumulatively allocated from their development budgets an approximate 3 billion shillings, public funds supplemented by other additional financing from development partners and private sources towards climate action. In the heart of local development and local governance, the county governments have institutionalized the ward and sub-county climate change planning committees that identify, plan, and prioritize adaptations and mitigation projects based on their needs to accelerate adaptive capacity and resilience building. The strengthened capacities at communities and county level has contributed significantly in the development of participatory climate resilient assessment, PCRA tool, and further county climate action plans, CCAPs, meant to guide the counties in the next 5 years with prioritized climate investments which are mainstreamed in the county integrated development plans, CIDPs, and annual development plans, ADPs. Underlying the principle of subsidiarity and borrowing from the bottom-up approach, the synthesized county climate change plans translate into the National Climate Change Action Plan for the county, which will be launched today, which is a tool that will enable us meet our ambitious national determined contributions that commits to abate greenhouse gases emission by 32% by 2030. In this context, counties have a central role in their contribution to reducing emissions, and in this regard, counties have met various performance measures for the county climate resilience investments under FLOCA program. The average of USD $1.25 million under the CCRI grant will steer counties in a move aimed at achieving their climate objectives and aspirations. This is through various community and county prioritized projects, including afforestation and reforestation programs, aligning with the 15 billion tree growing agenda led by His Excellency the President, clean energy development, integrated water resource management, water service provision, climate smart agriculture, disaster management, transition to circular economy, and climate proofing of county infrastructure, amongst other projects. Implementing targeted capacity building initiatives, innovations, and knowledge management programs in counties is integral towards supporting building of strong institutions. Investing in climate change data systems for various devolved sectors and the generation of climate data sets relevant to various sectors, climate vulnerability and resilience index, climate incentives including carbon trading, and county financing tracking, monitoring and reporting are critical drivers to climate sensitive growth and transformation. This launch today brings us together to celebrate the journey towards the envisaged low carbon development pathway by fostering cooperation, collaboration, and learning between the national and county governments, as well as advancing the common goal to green growth and climate finance solutions in Africa and the world. Finally, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, county governments are committed to enhance county planning, budgeting, and execution of allocated resources for climate action through actual investment in climate adaptation and mitigation by realigning resources within and across sectors to effectively address local needs and align with national priorities for effective service delivery. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Governor Waiguru. A round of applause to her. Your Excellency, the success of the FLOCA program depends on the county government. They are highly expectant today on the release of the investment grant check. But to confirm that, I would like to invite the Cabinet Secretary in charge of National Treasury, Professor Ndungu, to confirm that there will be a check to be issued to the county government. And as he comes, I want to reiterate to Your Excellency that the chair of the Project Management Committee of the FLOCA program is P.S. Kipto of the National Treasury. I co-chair with him, and the CEO of Council of Governors. Thank you. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much, and Your Excellency, let me appreciate and acknowledge all the protocols that have been observed. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm also very happy that this afternoon I just want to start by extending warm welcome to all who are present, who came to this Africa Climate Summit. I would also like to express my sincere gratitude to the organizers for this important event on locally led climate action. It is important because of its timing. Particularly, also it's noteworthy that as we launch this strategy, we are going to launch four areas that have been actually talked about. The first one is actually long-term low emission strategy that is going to be launched. The second one is National Climate Change Action Plan, that is NCCAP 2023 to 2027. The third one is Climate Change Act of 2023. Again, it has been mentioned by P.S. Ngeno. And then finally, we want to make sure that we launch the county investment grants under the Financing Local-Led Climate Action, which is FROCA. This event demonstrates the government of Kenya's commitment and its in tackling the climate change through enabling policy frameworks and also pioneering leadership on stepping up financing at the local level. Your Excellencies, I will also focus my remarks on the Financing Local-Led Climate Action Program, FROCA, and the launch of the county investment grants, which I think PS volunteered to actually provide the information, so I have no surprises to make. The FROCA program is designed to encourage cross-agency collaboration and vertical linkages from the community level up to the national level in addressing climate change action. It is a pioneer program for developing and even decentralizing climate finance in scale to specifically specifically deliver local-led climate adaptation and even some resilience actions, as well as strengthen county and national governments' institutional capacity to predict, plan, budget, implement, and monitor, report, and even report climate actions that have been successful. It is important to note that without financial support that helps communities to develop in an inclusive manner and adapt to climate impacts, climate change is projected to push tens of millions, especially at the rural level, into extreme and even abject poverty. This has happened. For example, what we experienced last year and the beginning of this year has been a good example that food security and climate change became quite devastating and reversed all efforts in terms of poverty reduction and even fighting inequality, and even introduced the dimension of civil conflict because of fight for natural resources. We have managed to secure a total of $297 million to finance this program. And I want to list how they have been contributed. The World Bank has provided from the IDA US $150 million. Denmark, through Danida, has provided $8.9 million. Sweden, through CEDA, has provided $14.4 million. German government, through KfW, has provided $3.7 million. The Netherlands have provided $10 million. The government of Kenya has also made a contribution of $5 million, but it's also very important and encouraging to notice that the counties themselves, consistent with what Her Excellency Governor Iguru has mentioned, the 47 counties have made a contribution of $75 million, Your Excellency. So you can see that it's really some very important for us to recognize that. We are therefore honored and delighted to join the global community and our development partners to jointly launch the Country Climate Resilience Investment Grants under the FROCA program. Today's launch of the program's investment grant for the counties is a milestone and a testament towards accelerating a low-carbon and climate-resilient path through enhanced mobilization of resources that will finance these actions. During the financial year 2022-2023, the National Treasury transferred to the counties a total of Kenya shillings 979 million for the FROCA County Institutional Support Grant. The launch of the Kenya shillings 7.387 billion for the financial year 2023 to 2024 would therefore go a long way in strengthening the county's capacity and even capability to implement the low carbon and climate resilient interventions. The imminent implementation of the FROCA program by rural county governments signifies and even becomes a monumental step forward. It is significant that our collective determination to transform our climate change challenges into opportunities for growth and sustainability becomes very critical. This initiative is not merely a directive, it is a testament to our shared belief in fostering resilient communities and safeguarding the well-being of the current and the future generations. Your Excellencies, we are happy to note that the high commitment by the county governments to implement the FROCA program is quite admirable. This is demonstrated by the keenness, the speed at which they have implemented some of the activities, and they have put in place the necessary climate change policies, registration, and even institutional capacities. So I'm very happy that we have come to this far, and we are very encouraged by that heterogeneity. In conclusion, Your Excellencies, I wish to thank our development partners for their collaboration and financial support in this initiative. By embracing the financing of locally led initiatives and uniting our expertise and aspirations, we are fostering a culture of collaboration and innovation. Finally, also, it's also good to mention that it is a showcase for Kenya so that other African countries can follow suit, so that we not only deal with the national level issues, but also at the local and county level devolved functions. Thank you very much, Your Excellency.
Thanks so much, Professor Ndungu, Cabinet Secretary. At least it's confirmed the financing is there. We appreciate you. Your Excellency, as I come to the end of this segment, allow me to invite Honorable Soipan Tuya, the Cabinet Secretary in charge of Environment, Climate Change, and Forestry, whose responsibility is to work with the counties in mainstreaming the programs of LTS, NCAP, Climate Change Amendment, and the FLOCA programs. Welcome, Waziri.
Thank you, PS. Your Excellency, Dr. William Ruto, President of the Republic of Kenya, Excellency Julius Maada, President of Sierra Leone, Excellency Nangolo Mbumba, Vice President of Namibia, Excellency Rigathi Gachagua, President of the Republic, Deputy President of the Republic of Kenya, Excellency Governors present here, led by Her Excellency Anne Waiguru, Chair of the Council of Governors of Kenya, Honorable colleague ministers present here, Excellency Ambassadors, Principal Secretaries, Heads of Development Partners, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Your Excellency, this event here is a demonstration that beside your leadership at the African Union level as a chair of the Committee of African Heads of State and Government on Climate Change, as well as you're rallying the globe around collective climate action, that indeed you are leading from the front right here in Kenya. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to host you today at this event organized by the Ministry of Environment, Climate Change and Forestry, together with the Ministry of National Treasury and Planning. I take this opportunity to thank all our development partners who have supported the processes that we are launching and unveiling here today. These include the World Bank, UNDP, the governments of Germany, Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Thank you for standing with the government of Kenya in this endeavor. Kenya developed its long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies, LTS, which aims to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 while retaining the economic development trajectory. It sets out a vision, objectives, and priority interventions for delivering economic growth. It also assesses socio-economic losses associated with climate hazards as well as an estimation of the cost of adaptation interventions, and will be critical in guiding the successive nationally determined contributions as well as the national climate change action plans up to 2050. Excellencies, distinguished guests, to align climate change actions to the government's development agenda and implementation of Kenya's nationally determined contributions and LTS, we have the National Climate Change Action Plan that is reviewed every 5 years. Today, we present for launching the reviewed National Climate Change Action Plan 3 for 2023 up to 2027. The development of the National Action Plan was guided by a steering committee, very consultative, involving the participation of state departments and agencies of the national government, county governments, civil society, the private sector, academia, a wide range of individuals and institutions. It therefore reflects the various sector commitments to address climate change in the next 5 years. And as a ministry, we recognize and applaud these individual and collective efforts. Excellencies, we are also launching the recently assented to Climate Change Act Amendment of 2023. Kenya enacted the Climate Change Act in 2016. However, to make it responsive to the aspirations of the Paris Agreement on Sustainable Development and alleviation of poverty, we have just amended this law to capture a regulatory framework for carbon markets, which will ensure high integrity, high quality, and transparent engagements in the carbon market framework. We are proud today, as a ministry and as government, to present one-of-a-kind carbon market regulatory framework law in Africa. We wish to thank the Houses of Parliament for support, as well as His Excellency, the President, for assenting this bill into law in the last few days. We witnessed a lot of huge interest from individual Kenyans, non-state actors, and therefore it is a reflection of the ambition of Kenyans towards creating an enabling environment for investment in our carbon credits. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, adequate and predictable climate finance is key for implementation of climate action. This calls for enhanced resource mobilization through bilateral, multilateral, and concessional funding. The Financing Locally Led Climate Action Program, FLOCA, is one of these attempts and has crowdfunding from the World Bank, governments of Germany, Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, as well as the government of Kenya, to the tune of $295 million US. It is important to note that over 80% of these funds will flow directly to our devolved units at the ward level to support local level climate action. This is squarely in the core of our bottom-up economic transformation agenda. Today, we will witness the handing over of the first tranche for county governments, which will be utilized for the local level support, community resilient investments. And I am looking forward to breathing life into our intergovernmental framework together with Excellency governors present here through this collaboration and beyond. As a government led by His Excellency the President, we also launched the 15 billion tree growing national landscape and ecosystem restoration program. This was in December of last year. And this is part of our climate action to support carbon sequestration. And we have our targets set out clearly. And Your Excellencies present here today, as I said, that Kenya is leading from the front. We continue to push the envelope beyond the business as usual scenario. We continue to push the envelope beyond the set targets, because as it is the main gist of the summit, the Africa Climate Summit, what we are all doing from the global level is not enough. We have to take our initiatives to a bigger scale. We have to react with the urgency as well as the inclusivity and global efforts to make sure that we all achieve our targets. I conclude by thanking all of you for the continued support accorded to the government of Kenya and through all these policies, laws and strategies on climate action. Receive our utmost assurance of their effective implementation to facilitate and implement climate action across the country. With those remarks, I now take this opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to invite His Excellency President of the Republic of Kenya, William Ruto, to make his remarks. Welcome, Your Excellency.